Ribeye, medium rare, he barked in German, not bothering to look up. Arrogant prick. But I knew what was coming, knew he was being watched. Filmed. That blue-tie bastard 2 tables over, angling his phone just so. Pathetic, really. What they didn't know, couldn't possibly guess, was that I had my own reasons to protect him. They thought I was just another waitress. Invisible. Stupid. They had no idea I knew every cutthroat trick in the game, or how her quiet kindness will change everything. No idea I was about to flip the script. Not for money, but for something far more valuable. Dignity. The crystal chandeliers of Lernadan cast golden shadows across Alexander Sterling's sharp jawline as he leaned back in his chair, savoring the moment. At 33, he commanded respect in every room he entered. 6'2" of pure confidence wrapped in a custom Armani suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. His steel gray eyes surveyed the restaurant's elite clientele with practiced indifference. Gentlemen, Alexander addressed his potential investors in fluent German, his voice carrying that unmistakable authority that had built his tech empire from nothing. Duskin, the business will be very profitable. His guests, 2 elderly German businessmen worth collectively over $2 billion, nodded approvingly. Alexander knew exactly how to play this game. Speaking their language wasn't just courtesy, it was power. It showed preparation, respect, and most importantly, control. The waitress approached their table with practiced grace, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Green eyes focused professionally on her notepad. Alexander barely glanced at her. Service staff were invisible to him, part of the restaurant's ambiance like the expensive art on the walls. Hedagonda's ribby steak medium, rare middle sauce, he said smoothly, not bothering to look up from his phone where he was checking stock prices. I'd like the ribeye steak, medium rare, with truffle sauce. What happened next shattered his perfectly controlled world. The waitress didn't fumble for a translation app or look confused. Instead, she calmly wrote something on a piece of paper, folded it once, and placed it discreetly beside his water glass. Her movements were so smooth, so practiced that neither of his guests noticed. Alexander's fingers found the note almost involuntarily. His eyes never left his phone screen, maintaining his facade of disinterested authority, but every nerve in his body was suddenly alert. The paper felt expensive between his fingers, not the cheap notepad paper he'd expected. He unfolded it carefully, keeping it below the table. You're being filmed. The man with the blue tie 2 tables away. Be careful. Alexander's blood turned to ice. His eyes flicked up to meet the waitress's for the first time, and what he saw there knocked the breath from his lungs. Intelligence. Sharp, calculating intelligence that had nothing to do with taking dinner orders. And something else. A warning, genuine concern that made no sense coming from a complete stranger. Assistant, he managed, his voice slightly as he addressed his guests about the wine selection while his mind raced. That is interesting. Without making it obvious, he glanced toward the table she'd indicated. There, a lean man in his 40s with a blue silk tie holding his phone at just the right angle. Alexander's stomach dropped. He recognized the setup. Industrial espionage. Someone was recording their conversation, probably hoping to get details about his latest acquisition before tomorrow's announcement. The waitress moved to take his guests' orders, her demeanor perfectly professional, but Alexander caught the subtle way she positioned herself to block the phone's angle. She was protecting him. But why? Era, sir, she asked his first guest, her German accent flawless, but somehow different. Not native, but educated, refined in a way that made Alexander's business instincts scream questions. Your order, sir. As she worked her way around the table, Alexander studied her with the same intensity he applied to merger negotiations. Her hands, no calluses from washing dishes. Nails too well maintained for someone working doubles in restaurant service. Her posture, straight, confident, like someone accustomed to being in charge. And her German. There was something aristocratic about her pronunciation, something that reminded him of his university professors who'd studied in Vienna. Who was this woman? Dankun, she said softly as she finished taking orders, but she lingered just long enough to catch his eye again. There was a story there hidden behind professional courtesy, and Alexander Sterling had built his fortune on reading people. "Thank you very much." "Excuse me, gentlemen," he said to his guests, switching back to English. "I need to make a quick call." He stood, notes still clutched in his palm, and walked toward the restaurant's private corridor as if heading to the restroom. But instead, he waited in the shadows, watching the mysterious waitress work her section. She moved like a dancer with economy and grace that spoke of expensive training. When she thought no one was looking, her professional smile dropped, replaced by something harder, more guarded. She was running from something or someone. Alexander was certain of it. His phone buzzed. A text from his head of security. "Intercepted attempt to bug your table tonight. We've handled it." Alexander's pulse quickened. The woman had been right about the surveillance. But how had she known? And more importantly, why had she warned him? He returned to his table, where his guests were deep in discussion about market projections. The ribeye arrived perfectly cooked, presented with the truffle sauce he'd requested, but Alexander barely tasted it. His attention was completely focused on the enigmatic waitress, who just saved him from a corporate disaster. When she returned to refill their water glasses, he caught her wrist gently. "Excuse me," he said quietly in English, pitched low enough that his guest couldn't hear. "I wanted to thank you for the recommendation." Her green eyes met his directly for the first time, and Alexander felt something shift in his chest. Beautiful didn't begin to cover it. There was depth there, intelligence, and pain carefully hidden behind professional politeness. "Just doing my job, sir," she replied, but her slight smile suggested otherwise. "I'm Alexander," he said, still holding her wrist. Her skin was warm, soft, but he could feel a small scar along her palm. "Another mystery." "Emma," she said simply, gently pulling free. "Enjoy your dinner, Mr. Sterling." She knew his name. She'd known who he was from the moment she'd approached the table. Alexander watched her walk away, his mind spinning with possibilities. In 33 years, no one had ever surprised him like this. No one had ever protected him without wanting something in return. As his guests discussed investment terms, Alexander found himself stealing glances across the dining room. Emma moved through her section with practiced efficiency, but he caught moments. The way she automatically straightened a crooked picture frame, the subtle correction of a younger server's posture, the instant recognition of a wine vintage when asked by another customer. This was no ordinary waitress. "Alexander," one of his guests prompted. "Your thoughts on the European expansion?" "Right." Alexander refocused, but part of his mind remained on Emma. "I believe we're looking at unprecedented growth opportunities." As the evening wound down and his guests prepared to leave, Alexander made a decision that would change everything. Instead of his usual practice of leaving business dinners immediately after handshakes were exchanged, he lingered. "I'll catch up with you tomorrow," he told his driver through text, taking care of something here. Emma was clearing tables in her section when he approached. Up close, he noticed more details that didn't fit her job description. A slight tan line where an expensive watch had been, a faint scar on her temple that looked surgical, and the way she held herself like someone accustomed to boardrooms, rather than dining rooms. "We're closed to new diners," she said without looking up. "I'm not here for dinner," Alexander replied. "I'm here for answers." Emma straightened slowly, weariness replacing her professional demeanor. "I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Sterling. You saved me from corporate espionage tonight. You speak German like you were educated in Austria, and you carry yourself like you've run companies rather than served them." Alexander stepped closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "So, I'll ask again. Who are you, really, Emma?" For a long moment, they stared at each other across the empty dining room. The last customers had left. The other servers had finished their closing duties, and Alexander could hear his own heartbeat in the sudden silence. Emma's carefully constructed mask finally cracked. "Someone who learned the hard way that powerful men can't be trusted," she said quietly, her accent slipping slightly, revealing something more refined, more educated. "And someone who's trying very hard to stay invisible." "From who?" Alexander asked, every protective instinct he didn't know he possessed. Suddenly firing, Emma looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth she could afford. "From people who would do anything to make sure I never reclaim What was stolen from me? Old too. Alexander Sterling had built his empire on reading people, but Emma was an enigma that challenged everything he thought he knew about human nature. He arrived at Lernadan the next evening, despite having no business meeting scheduled, telling himself he was simply ensuring his security team had properly handled the surveillance threat. It was a lie, and he knew it. Emma was training a new server when he entered, her patient explanations revealing an expertise that had nothing to do with restaurant work. The 2018 Chasson Montrach should be served at exactly 55 degrees, she was saying to a nervous-looking young man. If a customer questions the vintage, explain that this particular vineyard had an exceptional harvest year due to late-season rains in Burgundy. Alexander slipped into a corner booth, fascinated. Emma's knowledge of wine was encyclopedic, her manner authoritative but kind. She moved through the restaurant like she owned it, solving problems with quiet efficiency that spoke of natural leadership. "Mr. Sterling," she said when she finally noticed him, her professional mask sliding back into place. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "Your German pronunciation," he said without preamble. "It's Viennese, upper class, old money." Emma's composure flickered for just a moment, long enough for Alexander to catch a flash of something that might have been panic. "I studied abroad," she said carefully. "Where?" Alexander leaned forward, his business instincts fully engaged. "Because I spent 2 years in Vienna for my MBA, and I recognize the accent." "It's not learned, Emma. It's native." She glanced around the dining room, noting which tables were occupied, calculating how private their conversation could be. The gesture was automatic, practiced, the behavior of someone who'd been hunted. "You're very observant for a customer," she said finally. "You're very evasive for a waitress," Alexander countered, then softened his tone. "Look, I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable, but yesterday you saved me from what could have been a catastrophic security breach. I owe you." Emma's laugh was bitter, surprising him. "Trust me, Mr. Sterling, you don't owe me anything. In fact, you'd probably be better off forgetting we ever met." "Why?" Alexander asked. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Emma stared at him for a long moment, and Alexander saw her making a decision that went against every instinct she'd developed. "The kind of trouble that destroys everything it touches," she said quietly. "The kind that follows you across oceans and through new identities until there's nowhere left to run." Alexander felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What happened to you?" Before Emma could answer, the restaurant's manager approached their table. "Emma, Table 6 is asking about wine pairings for the seafood menu," he said, his tone carrying just enough authority to remind everyone present of the hierarchy. "Of course, Mr. Davidson," Emma replied smoothly, but Alexander caught the way her jaw tightened. "I'll be right there." She started to move away, but Alexander caught her hand. "When do you get off work?" he asked. "Mr. Sterling." "Alexander?" he corrected. "And it's not what you think. I want to help." Emma's green eyes searched his face, looking for deception, for hidden motives. Alexander had the unsettling feeling that she was far better at reading people than he'd initially realized. "Why?" she asked finally. It was a fair question, and Alexander found himself without his usual quick answer. Why was he pursuing this? He had everything: money, power, respect. His life was perfectly ordered, completely under his control. Emma represented chaos, uncertainty, the possibility of complications he didn't need. "Because yesterday you trusted me enough to warn me about danger," he said. "Maybe it's time someone returned the favor." Emma studied him for another heartbeat, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "I finish at 11 Ecoris," she said. "There's a coffee shop on 42nd Street called Midnight Grounds. It's quiet." Alexander smiled, surprised by the relief that flooded through him. "I'll be there." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of routine meetings and conference calls, but Alexander found his attention constantly drifting to the clock. At 10:45, he was sitting in Midnight Grounds, a hole-in-the-wall coffee shop that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s, perfect for a private conversation. Emma arrived at 11:15, having changed from her server uniform into jeans and a simple sweater that somehow made her look younger and more vulnerable. She'd let her hair down, and Alexander realized she was even more beautiful than he'd initially thought. "Thank you for waiting," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. "Thank you for coming," Alexander replied, signaling the waitress for 2 coffees. "I wasn't sure you would." Emma wrapped her hands around her mug when it arrived, as if seeking warmth. "I almost didn't. This goes against every survival instinct I've developed over the past 2 years." 2 years, Alexander repeated. "Is that how long you've been running?" Emma's smile was sad. "Running implies I have somewhere to go. I've been hiding." "From who?" Alexander leaned forward, his voice gentle but insistent. Emma was quiet for so long that Alexander began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "From my former fiancé, from his family, from people who would kill to make sure certain truths never come to light." Alexander felt ice form in his veins. "Kill? You asked who I really am," Emma said, meeting his eyes directly. "My name is Emma von Habsburg. 3 years ago, I was the heir to a textile empire worth 800 million. I had a PhD in international business from Oxford, spoke 6 languages, and was engaged to marry the son of one of Austria's most prominent banking families." Alexander's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. Von Habsburg. He knew the name, old Austrian nobility, with business interests spanning 3 continents. But the company had collapsed amid scandal. "The embezzlement charges," he said slowly, pieces clicking into place. Emma nodded, pain flickering across her features. $50 million supposedly transferred to offshore accounts in my name, except I never saw a penny of it. My fiancé, Victor Kinnair, had been systematically looting the company for months. When the board discovered the theft, he made sure all evidence pointed to me. "Your own fiancé framed you?" Alexander's voice carried disbelief and growing anger. "Brilliantly," Emma said bitterly. "He had access to my passwords, my signatures, my private accounts. By the time I realized what was happening, I was facing 20 years in prison for crimes I didn't commit." Alexander's hands clenched into fists. The story was horrific enough, but the casual way Emma described it, as if she'd accepted the betrayal as inevitable, made him furious. "How did you escape?" he asked. "My grandmother," Emma said, her voice softening slightly. "She never believed I was guilty. She liquidated her personal assets and bought me just enough time to disappear before the arrest warrant was executed. New identity, new passport, new life. And Victor," Emma's expression hardened, "married his backup plan, my younger cousin Helena, 6 months later. The family welcomed him with open arms, grateful he'd saved them from my supposed treachery. Last I heard, he was running for parliament on a platform of financial reform and ethics." Alexander stared at her, his mind reeling. The woman sitting across from him, this intelligent, dignified woman serving tables to survive, had once commanded boardrooms and international negotiations. The injustice of it made his chest tight with rage. "Emma," he said carefully, "there has to be evidence. Financial records, security footage, something that could prove your innocence." "I spent 18 months trying to find it," Emma replied. Victor was thorough. "Every trail leads back to me. Every witness has either disappeared or changed their story. Even if I could prove my innocence, I'd have to surface to do it. And the moment I show my face in Europe, they'd kill you," Alexander finished. Emma nodded. "Victor's family has connections everywhere. Government, law enforcement, international finance. I'm not just a fugitive, Alexander. I'm a loose end that threatens their entire operation." Alexander leaned back, processing everything she'd told him. Emma von Habsburg, brilliant, educated, betrayed in the worst possible way by someone she trusted with her heart. No wonder she'd warned him about the surveillance. She knew firsthand how dangerous powerful men could be. "Why did you tell me this?" he asked finally. Emma was quiet for a moment, studying his face. "Because yesterday you proved you're different. Most men in your position would have ignored my warning, assumed I was overstepping my place, but you listened. You acted." And she hesitated. "And I'm tired of being alone." Something shifted in Alexander's chest, a protective instinct so strong it surprised him. This woman had lost everything, yet she'd still risked exposure to help a stranger. She was extraordinary, and she'd been surviving on her own for 2 years. "You're not alone anymore," he said quietly. Emma's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. Alexander, you don't understand what you're offering. Being associated with me is dangerous. If Victor's people discover you know who I am, let me worry about Victor's people. Alexander interrupted, his voice carrying the steel that had built his empire. I didn't become a billionaire by backing away from fights. For the first time since she'd started her story, Emma smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face. You really don't know what you're getting into, she said. Alexander reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Then I guess you'll have to teach me. The touch sent electricity through both of them, and Alexander saw Emma's breath catch. The attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface suddenly blazed to life, complicated by everything they just shared. Alexander, Emma whispered, but she didn't pull her hand away. I know, he said softly. This is complicated, dangerous. Probably the worst idea either of us has ever had. Definitely the worst idea, Emma agreed, but she turned her palm up to intertwine their fingers. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the magnitude of what had just shifted between them. Alexander had never met anyone like Emma, strong enough to survive betrayal and exile, smart enough to reinvent herself completely, brave enough to risk everything to help someone else. And Emma was looking at Alexander like he might actually be exactly what she'd given up hoping for. So, what happens now? She asked. Alexander smiled, feeling more alive than he had in years. Now we figure out how to get your life back. 03. Alexander Sterling had always prided himself on his logical approach to business and life, but nothing about his growing obsession with Emma von Habsburg made sense. For 3 days, he'd found excuses to eat at Lernan. Watching her work while pretending to conduct phone meetings, her grace under pressure fascinated him. The way she handled difficult customers with dignity that spoke of royal breeding. Tonight was different. Tonight he'd finally worked up the courage to make his move. Emma, he said when she approached his table, her professional smile already in place. Do you have plans after work? She glanced around the dining room automatically, a habit she'd developed to assess potential threats. Why, do you ask? Because I have something to show you, something that might help with your situation. Emma's carefully controlled expression flickered. Over the past week, their late-night coffee meetings had become routine, but Alexander had never mentioned taking action on her behalf. She'd been clear that any attempt to investigate her case would be dangerous for both of them. Alexander, we talked about this. Just trust me, he interrupted gently. Please. An hour later, Emma found herself in the back of Alexander's Tesla, heading toward the Upper East Side. She'd changed from her work uniform into the one nice dress she owned, a simple black sheath that had somehow survived her hasty escape from Vienna. Where are we going? She asked as they pulled up to a building that screamed expensive. My apartment, Alexander said, then quickly added, I have something to show you on my secure computer, something I think you'll want to see. Emma hesitated. Being alone with Alexander in his home crossed every line she'd drawn for her own protection, but the hope in his voice was impossible to ignore. Alexander's penthouse was everything Emma had expected, and nothing like what she'd prepared for emotionally. Yes, it was luxurious, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, artwork that belonged in museums, furniture that cost more than most people's cars. But it was also somehow warm, lived in, with books scattered across surfaces and a half-finished chess game on the coffee table. Wine? Alexander offered, moving toward a well-stocked bar. I probably shouldn't, Emma said, then caught herself. Actually, yes. It's been a long time since I've had good wine. Alexander poured 2 glasses of what Emma immediately recognized as a Chateau d'Em, easily $300 a bottle. She accepted it gratefully, noting that his choice revealed impeccable taste. So, she said, settling onto his leather sofa, what did you want to show me? Alexander's expression grew serious. He moved to his desk and opened a laptop, typing in what appeared to be multiple security passwords. I hope you won't be angry, he said without turning around, but I had my security team do some discreet investigating into your case. Emma's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. Alexander, no, I told you how dangerous. Nothing that could be traced back to you, he said quickly. But Emma, what they found? You need to see this. He turned the laptop screen toward her, and Emma's breath caught. Financial records filled the screen. Account transfers, transaction logs, digital signatures. But these weren't the doctor documents that had destroyed her life. These were raw bank records, the kind that were supposed to be impossible to access. How did you get these? She whispered. Alexander sat beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made her pulse quicken, despite everything. Let's just say I have resources Victor never anticipated, he said. Look at transaction 47B. Emma leaned forward, her financial training taking over. The transfer was dated 6 months before she'd been accused of embezzlement, a test transaction for $50,000, moving money from the Habsburg Company account to an offshore shell company, but the digital signature. That's not my signature, she breathed. The encryption is completely different. Exactly, Alexander said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Victor had been practicing forging your digital authorization for months. This was his trial run. Emma's hands shook as she scrolled through more documents. Transaction after transaction, all bearing Victor's crude attempts to replicate her signature style. To a casual observer, they might have looked authentic, but Emma knew her own security protocols better than anyone. He got sloppy, she said, her voice growing stronger as she spotted more inconsistencies. Look, transaction 52C was processed at 3:47 a.m. Vienna time. I was in London that week for the trade summit. There are hotel records, security footage already verified. Yeah, Alexander said softly. You gave 3 speeches that day, had dinner with the British trade minister, and your key card shows you were in your hotel room by midnight. Physically impossible for you to have authorized that transfer. Emma stared at the screen, years of helpless rage crystallizing into something sharper, more focused. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she had real evidence, proof that could exonerate her and expose Victor for what he really was. Why? She whispered, turning to face Alexander. Why would you risk this for me? Alexander's gray eyes met hers directly, and Emma saw something there that made her breath catch. Not pity, not charity, but something deeper and more dangerous. Because what happened to you was wrong, he said simply. And because you're extraordinary, Emma, you deserve justice. The air between them charged with electricity. Emma was acutely aware of how close they were sitting, how Alexander's sleeve was brushing against her bare arm, how his eyes kept dropping to her lips. This evidence, she said, struggling to focus on the laptop screen instead of the way Alexander was looking at her. It's enough to clear my name, but Victor still has too much power in Europe. Even with proof, he could make this disappear before it reaches the right people. Then we make sure it reaches everyone, Alexander said. Simultaneously, every major financial publication, law enforcement agency, and regulatory body in Europe make it impossible to suppress. Emma laughed, a sound caught between hope and hysteria. You make it sound so simple. Money makes a lot of things simple, Alexander replied. Then his expression grew more serious. But Emma, once we do this, there's no going back. Victor will know exactly who helped you. My company will become a target. Emma stood up abruptly, pacing to the windows that overlooked the glittering city. Alexander was offering her everything she dreamed of. Vindication, justice, the chance to reclaim her stolen life. But the cost. I can't ask you to do that, she said without turning around. You've already risked too much. She heard Alexander move behind her, felt his presence even before his hands settled gently on her shoulders. And you're not asking, he said quietly. I'm offering. Emma turned in his arms and suddenly they were standing closer than propriety allowed. Close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Alexander, she whispered, but she didn't step away. I know, he said, his voice rough. This is complicated. You're running from people who want to destroy you. I'm offering to wage war against international criminals, and we barely know each other. We barely know each other, Emma repeated, but her hands had somehow found their way to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart through his expensive shirt. Tell me to stop, Alexander said, his head lowering toward hers. Tell me this is a terrible idea and I'll drive you home right now. Emma looked up at him, this impossible man who'd appeared in her life like something from a fairy tale, wealthy enough to buy justice, powerful enough to take on her enemies, and somehow convinced she was worth the risk. It is a terrible idea, she whispered. Absolutely catastrophic, Alexander agreed, his lips now inches from hers. We could both lose everything. Everything, he confirmed, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. Alexander. Instead of finishing her sentence, Emma rose up on her toes and kissed him. The moment their lips met, 2 years of careful control shattered like glass. Alexander's arms came around her, pulling her against him, and Emma felt herself drowning in sensations she'd forgotten existed. He kissed like he conducted business with complete focus and devastating effectiveness. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Well, Alexander said, his voice rough with desire, that was unexpected. Emma laughed, surprising herself. Which part? The kissing or the fact that I'm considering letting you destroy an international crime syndicate on my behalf? Both, Alexander replied, then grew serious. Emma, I need you to understand. If we do this, if we expose Victor, there's no guarantee your old life will be there waiting for you. Your company is gone. Your family chose his side. Your social circles. I know, Emma said softly, but maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe it's time for a completely new life. Alexander's smile was slow and devastating. Are you sure? Because once we start this war, the only way out is victory. Emma thought about everything she'd lost, her fortune, her reputation, her trust in love. Then she looked at Alexander, this impossible man who'd walked into her life and offered her hope when she'd given up believing in it. Then we'd better make sure we win, she said. Alexander's answering grin was pure predatory satisfaction. Oh, we're going to win. Victor Kenner has no idea what's coming for him. As if on cue, Alexander's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. He glanced at it, and his expression grew grim. What is it? Emma asked, sudden fear replacing the warmth she'd been feeling. Alexander showed her the screen. The message was simple. She's been found. Recommend immediate relocation. Marcus. Emma's blood turned to ice. After 2 years of careful hiding, Victor's people had finally tracked her down. Her safe, anonymous life was over. How long do we have? She asked, her survival instincts kicking in. Not long, Alexander replied, but his voice carried steel determination instead of fear. Pack whatever you can't replace. You're staying with me until this is finished. Emma stared at him, this man who was offering to turn his entire life upside down for someone he'd known for less than a week. You're insane, she said. Probably, Alexander agreed. But I'm also completely sure that losing you now would be the biggest mistake of my life. Outside, the city glittered with millions of lights, each one representing someone living their safe, predictable existence. But inside Alexander Sterling's penthouse, 2 people were about to embark on the most dangerous gamble of their lives for justice, for truth, and for a love that had bloomed in the shadows of international conspiracy. The war for Emma's freedom was about to begin. The safe house Alexander had arranged was a fortress, disguised as a luxury hotel suite in Midtown Manhattan. 24-hour security, bulletproof glass, and enough surveillance equipment to make the FBI jealous. But as Emma stood at the window watching the street below, she felt more trapped than protected. 3 days had passed since Victor's people had found her, and the weight of dragging Alexander into her nightmare was crushing her spirit. She'd watched him transform from successful CEO to hunted man, fielding increasingly aggressive calls from business partners, demanding explanations for his sudden security measures. The Shanghai deal is falling apart, Alexander said, ending another tense phone call. My investors think I've lost my mind, moving the company into what they're calling fortress mode without explanation. Emma turned from the window, guilt eating at her like acid. Alexander had lost $15 million in canceled contracts over the past 72 hours, all because he'd decided to protect her. This was a mistake, she said quietly. I should go tonight. Disappear again before you lose everything. Alexander's expression hardened. We've been through this, Emma. I'm not letting you face this alone. Look around, Alexander. Emma gestured at the heavily secured room. This isn't living. This is a prison. And for what? A woman you've known for 2 weeks? The words hit their target. Alexander's jaw tightened, and Emma saw something flicker in his eyes. Doubt maybe, or the first crack in his resolve. Don't, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Don't reduce what we have to a timeline. What do we have? Emma challenged, her voice rising. A few stolen kisses? Some late-night conversations? You're destroying your life for someone who's brought you nothing but danger. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, and Emma saw the exact moment her words found their mark. The certainty in his eyes wavered, replaced by the cold calculation that had built his empire. Maybe you're right, he said finally. Maybe I have been thinking with something other than my brain. The words hit Emma like physical blows, even though she'd been trying to provoke exactly this reaction. She wanted him to walk away, to save himself before Victor destroyed him too. But hearing him actually question their connection felt like dying. Before either of them could say anything else, Alexander's secure phone rang. He answered it with sharp efficiency that reminded Emma of the arrogant CEO she'd first met. Sterling. Emma watched his face change as he listened, saw the blood drain from his cheeks. When? He asked tersely. How bad? More listening. Then Alexander's hand clenched into a fist. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up and turned to Emma, his expression grim. There's been an incident at my headquarters. Security breach. Files stolen. 2 employees hospitalized. His voice was completely flat, devoid of emotion. Victor's people just escalated. Emma felt her world collapse. This was exactly what she'd feared, what she'd tried to prevent by pushing Alexander away. Victor wasn't just hunting her anymore. He was systematically destroying everyone who tried to help her. Alexander, I'm so sorry. Don't, he interrupted, his voice like ice. Just don't. I need to handle this. I need to. He was already moving toward the door, grabbing his jacket and car keys. Emma watched him prepare to leave, saw him rebuilding the walls she'd spent 2 weeks helping him tear down. What about us? She asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Alexander paused at the door, his hand on the handle. When he turned back to her, his expression was the same one he wore in boardrooms. Professional, distant, untouchable. There is no us, Emma. There's just a businessman who made a series of increasingly poor decisions, and a woman who needs to find a different way to solve her problems. The door closed behind him with devastating finality. Emma stood alone in the safe house, surrounded by luxury that felt like a mockery. She'd gotten what she wanted. Alexander was walking away, protecting himself from her toxic situation. So why did victory feel like the worst kind of defeat? Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Miss me, darling. Time to come home. V. Victor had found her again, but this time she had no protector, no hope, no one willing to stand with her against the monster who'd stolen her life. Alexander was gone, probably already regretting every moment he'd spent trying to save her. Emma packed her single suitcase with mechanical precision. She'd run before she could run again. Maybe this time she'd find a place far enough away that Victor would eventually lose interest. Maybe she'd learn to stop hoping for rescue, stop believing in fairy tales about powerful men who actually cared about justice. As she prepared to disappear back into anonymity, Emma allowed herself one last look around the suite where she'd briefly believed in love again. Alexander's coffee mug still sat on the side table, his chess game half finished on the board, evidence of a life she'd been foolish enough to think she might share. She was reaching for the door handle when it opened from the outside. Marcus, Alexander's head of security, entered with 3 other men in expensive suits. Emma's blood ran cold. Had Alexander sent them to ensure she left quietly? Or worse, had Victor's people somehow infiltrated Alexander's team? Dr. von Hubsburg, Marcus said formally, please step away from the door. Emma's heart pounded as she calculated her chances of escape. 0. She realized these men were professionals, and she was trapped in a room 20 floors above the street. I was just leaving, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. No, Marcus replied. You're coming with us. Mr. Sterling's orders. Emma's confusion must have shown on her face because Marcus's professional expression softened slightly. There's something you need to know about what happened at the office today. he said. Something Mr. Sterling discovered that changes everything. 30 minutes later, Emma found herself in Alexander's private office, but it looked like a war zone. Computer screens had been shattered, filing cabinets torn open, papers scattered everywhere. And in the center of it all sat Alexander, staring at a single photograph with an expression of pure fury. He looked up when she entered, and Emma saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not the cold distance from their earlier fight, but something much more dangerous. Victor made a mistake, Alexander said quietly, holding up the photograph. He got sloppy. Emma moved closer, and her heart stopped. The photo showed her entering the safe house 3 days ago, but it wasn't taken from the street. It was taken from inside Alexander's building by someone with access to the executive floors. Someone on my board has been feeding Victor information, Alexander continued, his voice deadly calm. Someone I've trusted for years has been setting us up from the beginning. Emma stared at the photo, her mind racing. Who? Alexander's smile was purely predatory. David Chen, my oldest friend, business partner for 15 years, and apparently Victor's inside man from day one. The betrayal in Alexander's voice was devastating. Emma understood now why he'd seemed so broken when he left. Discovering that his closest friend had betrayed him had helped orchestrate the attack on his company and his employees. Alexander, she said softly, I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry, he replied, standing up with lethal grace. Be ready for war, because David just gave us the key to destroying Victor's entire operation. Emma's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Alexander moved to his damaged safe, entering a complex code. When it opened, he pulled out a thick file folder. David thought he was feeding Victor intelligence about our movements, Alexander explained. But what he actually did was document every communication, every transaction, every piece of evidence that proves Victor's guilt. He's been keeping records of his own crimes. Emma's hands shook as she opened the folder. Inside were bank records, encrypted communications, travel itineraries, a complete map of Victor's criminal network spanning 3 continents. This is everything, she whispered. Names, dates, amounts. Victor's entire operation is here. David was Victor's bagman, Alexander said grimly. Every payment, every bribe, every contract killing, it all went through David's shell companies. He thought he was protecting himself by keeping detailed records. Instead, he handed us Victor's head on a silver platter. Emma looked up at Alexander, seeing the man who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd survived betrayal by his closest friend and emerged stronger. What do we do with this? She asked. Alexander's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. We end this tonight. 4 hours later, Emma stood in Alexander's restored office. His team had worked miracles cleaning up the damage. Watching him coordinate the most complex takedown operation she'd ever witnessed. He had contacts at the FBI, Interpol, and financial regulatory agencies across 3 countries, all standing by to receive simultaneous data dumps that would destroy Victor's empire in a matter of hours. Emma, Alexander said, pausing in his orchestration to look at her directly. Once we do this, there's no going back. Victor will know exactly who destroyed him. Are you ready for that? Emma thought about everything Victor had stolen from her fortune, her reputation, her faith in love. Then she looked at Alexander, who'd risked everything to give her justice. I've been ready for 2 years, she said firmly. Alexander nodded, then addressed his assembled team. Gentlemen, execute Operation Habsburg. What followed was the most precisely coordinated assault Emma had ever witnessed. In the space of 30 minutes, Victor Knastner's criminal empire crumbled completely. Bank accounts frozen, arrest warrants issued, criminal evidence delivered to law enforcement agencies across Europe and North America. Emma watched it all unfold from Alexander's side, marveling at the man who'd orchestrated her salvation with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to corporate acquisitions. It's done, Alexander said, finally closing his laptop. Victor Knastner is finished. Emma felt tears she'd been holding back for years finally flow freely. After 2 years of running, hiding, surviving on scraps of hope, it was finally over. Victor would spend the rest of his life in prison, and she was free. Alexander, she said, turning to face him, what you've done, I can never repay you. I don't want repayment, Alexander replied, his voice softer now that the operation was complete. I want an apology. Emma blinked, confused. An apology for this afternoon? Alexander clarified, stepping closer. For trying to convince me that caring about you was a mistake, for suggesting that what we have isn't real? Emma's heart clenched with guilt. Alexander, I was trying to protect you. I know, he said gently, reaching up to cup her face. And I understand why. But Emma, the moment I met you, everything changed. I met you. My priorities, my goals, what I thought mattered. You didn't drag me into danger. You showed me what was worth fighting for. Emma leaned into his touch, feeling the last of her walls crumble. I thought I'd lost you forever when you walked out. You could never lose me, Alexander said firmly. I was angry, hurt, scared of how completely you turned my world upside down. But lose you? Impossible. Emma smiled through her tears. So what happens now? I'm free. Victor's in prison, and we're both still alive. What do we do with a happy ending? Alexander's answering smile was soft and full of promise. Now we build something new together. 5. 6 months after Victor Kner's empire crumbled, Emma von Habsburg stood in the boardroom of Sterling Industries, addressing a group of international investors with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place at the table. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the cautious waitress, replaced by the brilliant executive she'd always been meant to be. The Habsburg Foundation's first quarter exceeded all projections, Emma reported, her voice carrying the authority that came from genuine expertise. We've successfully repatriated over $200 million in stolen assets and provided legal assistance to 47 victims of international financial crime. Alexander watched from his position at the head of the conference table, pride radiating from every line of his body. Creating the Habsburg Foundation had been his idea, a way for Emma to reclaim her life's work while helping others who'd suffered similar injustices. Watching her command the room reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her brilliance before he'd ever kissed her. Impressive work, Dr. von Habsburg, said Margaret Chen, David's replacement on the board. The foundation's success reflects exceptionally well on Sterling Industries' commitment to corporate social responsibility. Emma smiled, accepting the compliment gracefully. Thank you, Miss Chen. The foundation's success is really a testament to Mr. Sterling's vision and the exceptional team he's assembled. As the meeting concluded and investors filed out, Alexander approached Emma with 2 cups of coffee, a ritual they'd developed over months of working together to rebuild her reputation and his company's security. You were magnificent, he said, handing her the cup. Watching you in your element never gets old. Emma accepted the coffee with a smile that made Alexander's heart skip. Flattery will get you everywhere, Mr. Sterling. I'm counting on it, Alexander replied, then grew more serious. Emma, there's something I wanted to discuss with you. Before he could continue, Emma's assistant appeared in the doorway. Dr. von Habsburg, there's someone here to see you. She says she's family. Emma's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Family meant Austria meant complications she'd hoped were permanently in her past. Who is it? Emma asked carefully. Helena Kastner, the assistant replied. She says she's your cousin. Emma's face went pale. Helena, Victor's wife, the woman who'd married Emma's betrayer and inherited the life that should have been Emma's. What could she possibly want? Should I send her away? Alexander asked, immediately protective. Emma considered for a moment, then shook her head. No, I need to face this. Will you stay with me? Always, Alexander replied without hesitation. Helena entered the conference room like a woman carrying the weight of the world. At 26, she was beautiful in the fragile way of European aristocracy, but her eyes held shadows that spoke of recent trauma. She wore black widow's weeds, Emma realized with surprise. Emma, Helena said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you for seeing me, Helena. Emma's voice was carefully neutral. I have to admit, I'm surprised. The last I heard, you were happily married to my former fiancé. Helena's composure cracked slightly. Victor is dead. The words hung in the air like a bomb. Emma felt Alexander tense beside her, his protective instincts on high alert. Dead? Emma repeated. How suicide, Helena said, her voice hollow. 3 days after his arrest, he couldn't face the prospect of spending his life in prison. So she trailed off, unable to finish. Emma felt a complicated mix of emotions: relief that her tormentor was gone, guilt for feeling that relief, and unexpected sympathy for the woman who'd been Victor's final victim. "I'm sorry for your loss," Emma said, meaning it. Whatever Helena had done, she clearly paid a price. "Don't be," Helena replied bitterly. "Victor was a monster. It took his death for me to understand how completely he'd manipulated all of us." She reached into her purse and withdrew a thick envelope. "Victor left a confession," Helena continued. "Everything he did to you, to your family's company, to dozens of other victims, he documented it all, thinking he could use it as leverage if he ever got caught. Instead, it's proof of your complete innocence." Emma's hands shook as she accepted the envelope. Gil. Inside were pages of Victor's handwriting, detailed admissions of guilt, explanations of how he'd framed her, lists of accomplices and victims. "Why are you bringing this to me?" Emma asked. Helena's eyes filled with tears. "Because I helped him destroy you. I believed his lies about your guilt, celebrated when he saved the family from your betrayal. I even wore your engagement ring, lived in the house he bought with your stolen money. I was complicit in every crime, even if I didn't understand what I was doing." Emma studied her cousin's face, seeing genuine remorse alongside the grief and guilt. "Helena," she said gently, "Victor manipulated you too. You were as much his victim as I was." "Was I?" Helena challenged herself. "Or did I choose to believe his version because it was easier than questioning the man I loved? I could have investigated, could have demanded proof of your guilt. Instead, I let myself be bought with luxury and status." Alexander, who'd been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "What do you want from Emma?" he asked directly. Helena straightened, finding some inner reserve of Habsburg dignity. "I want to make amends," she said. "The Austrian authorities have released your family's remaining assets. The properties, the art collection, the trust funds Victor couldn't liquidate. As Victor's widow, they legally belong to me now. I want to sign them back over to you, where they belong." Emma stared at her cousin in shock. The Habsburg estate was worth at least $50 million. Money that could fund her foundation's work for decades, restore her social position in Europe, give her back the life Victor had stolen. "Helena, that's incredibly generous, but I can't accept." "Yes, you can," Helena interrupted firmly. "It's not generosity, Emma. It's justice. That money was always yours. I'm just returning what was stolen." Emma looked at Alexander, who nodded encouragingly, then back at Helena. "What will you do?" Emma asked. "If you give up the inheritance, how will you live?" Helena smiled sadly. "I'll do what you did. Start over. Build something real instead of living off stolen wealth." Maybe you could use someone at the foundation who understands the European legal system." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. This was redemption in its purest form, not just for herself, but for her family name, for every relationship Victor had poisoned with his lies. "The foundation could use a director of European operations," Emma said slowly. "Someone who speaks the language, understands the culture, has connections in the right places." Helena's face lit up with the first genuine happiness Emma had seen from her. "I would be honored." Alexander stepped forward, extending his hand to Helena. "Welcome to the team, Miss Kastner." "Actually," Helena said, shaking his hand, "I'm thinking of going back to my maiden name, Helena von Habsburg, if that's acceptable to the head of the family." Emma laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "The head of the family would be delighted to have you back where you belong." As Helena left to begin the legal process of transferring the assets, Emma found herself alone with Alexander in the conference room that had hosted so many pivotal moments in their relationship. So Alexander said, settling into the chair beside hers, "You're now worth approximately $80 million. You have your family name restored, and you're running one of the most successful charitable foundations in North America. How does it feel to have your life back?" Emma considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she'd been a fugitive waitress with no hope of ever reclaiming her identity. Now she had wealth, status, purpose, and something even more precious: The love of a man who'd risked everything to help her find justice. It feels like a beginning, she said finally, like everything that came before was just preparation for what comes next. And what comes next? Alexander asked, though his tone suggested he had ideas of his own. Emma smiled, feeling mischievous for the first time in years. Well, there is one small problem we need to address. What's that? Alexander asked, suddenly concerned. We've been working together for 6 months, and you still haven't officially asked me on a proper date? Emma said, her eyes twinkling. I'm beginning to think you're not serious about this relationship. Alexander's worried expression melted into laughter. You're absolutely right. That's a terrible oversight on my part. He stood up formally, then turned to face her with exaggerated seriousness. Dr. Emma von Habsburg, would you do me the honor of having dinner with me tonight, somewhere with actual menus instead of takeout containers and financial documents? Emma pretended to consider the invitation carefully. I suppose I could clear my schedule, but I have very high standards for first dates, Mr. Sterling. I hope you're prepared to impress me, lady, Alexander said with a grin that made Emma's pulse quicken. I've been preparing to impress you since the moment you slipped me that warning note. Tonight, I'm pulling out all the stops. As evening approached, Emma stood in her apartment, a beautiful place Alexander had helped her find when she'd finally felt safe enough to stop hiding, preparing for what felt like the most important first date of her life. It was ridiculous, really. She and Alexander had been through everything together. Danger, betrayal, professional collaboration, and enough stolen kisses to fuel a dozen romance novels. But somehow this felt different, official, like they were finally free to explore what they could be together without the shadow of Victor's threats hanging over them. The knock on her door came at exactly 7 p.m., punctuality being one of Alexander's more endearing corporate habits. Emma opened it to find him holding a bouquet of Austrian white roses, looking devastatingly handsome in a navy blue suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and gray eyes. For the lady, he said, offering the flowers with a slight bow that managed to be both playful and genuinely romantic. Austrian roses, Emma said, accepting the bouquet. How did you know they were my favorites? Lucky guess, Alexander replied, but his pleased expression suggested he'd done his research. Are you ready for the evening of a lifetime? Emma smiled, feeling like the luckiest woman alive. With you? I've been ready since the moment you decided I was worth saving. Alexander's expression grew serious for a moment. Emma, you saved yourself. I just provided backup. We saved each other, Emma corrected, standing on her toes to kiss him softly. And now we get to see what comes next. As they headed out into the New York evening, Emma reflected on the impossible journey that had brought them together. From the moment she'd warned a stranger about surveillance to this perfect first date, every step had led them closer to something neither had expected to find. A love worth fighting for, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values, and the promise of a future they could build together. The war was over, the healing had begun, and love, as always, had found a way to triumph over even the darkest circumstances. 6. 1 year later, Emma stood in the same Lernadan dining room where she'd first met Alexander. But everything had changed. Instead of wearing a server's uniform, she was dressed in an elegant emerald gown that complemented her engagement ring, a stunning vintage piece Alexander had chosen because it reminded him of her eyes. Tonight was the Habsburg Foundation's first annual gala, and the restaurant buzzed with New York's elite, all gathered to celebrate the organization's remarkable success. Ladies and gentlemen, Emma said from the small stage Alexander's team had erected, when I started working in this room 2 years ago, I never imagined I'd be standing here as your host instead of your waitress. Laughter rippled through the crowd, warm and appreciative. Emma had learned to be open about her past. Finding that honesty about her journey only made her more compelling as a leader. The Habsburg Foundation has accomplished something extraordinary in our first year, she continued. We've recovered over $300 million in stolen assets, provided legal aid to 200 victims of financial crime, and most importantly, we've proven that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. Applause filled the room, and Emma caught sight of Alexander at his table near the front. He was watching her with undisguised pride and love, and she had to pause for a moment to collect herself. But tonight isn't just about celebrating our past victories, Emma said, her voice growing stronger. It's about announcing our future. I'm thrilled to share that the Habsburg Foundation will be expanding to Europe next year with offices in Vienna, London, and Geneva. We're taking the fight against international financial crime global. The applause was thunderous this time. Emma had worked for months to make this expansion possible, using her restored connections in European high society and Alexander's business acumen to create something unprecedented. A privately funded international justice organization with the resources to take on the most powerful criminals in the world. As dinner was served, the same menu Learned had offered the night Emma had first warned Alexander about surveillance. She moved through the room like the accomplished hostess she'd been trained to be from childhood. But now she was using those skills for a purpose that mattered, building relationships that could help victims rather than simply maintaining social status. Emma, said James Morrison, one of New York's most prominent attorneys, I have to ask, are you and Alexander planning to make this partnership official? The rumors have been circulating for months. Emma smiled mysteriously. You'll have to ask Alexander about his intentions, Mr. Morrison, but I will say that we're very happy with our current arrangement. It wasn't entirely true. They were happy, deeply and completely happy. But Emma had been wondering for months when Alexander would propose. They lived together, worked together, shared everything important in their lives. But Alexander hadn't mentioned marriage since their first date, when he joked about their relationship being the beginning of something permanent. As the evening wound down and the last guest departed, Emma found herself alone with Alexander in the empty restaurant. The staff had finished cleaning. The flowers had been packed away, and they had the dining room to themselves. Successful evening, Alexander said, pulling her into his arms. You were magnificent as always. Thank you, Emma replied, settling comfortably against his chest. I still can't quite believe how different my life is from the last time I stood in this room. Different how? Alexander asked, though his tone suggested he knew exactly what she meant. 2 years ago, I was hiding from my past, afraid to trust anyone, convinced I'd never have a real life again. Emma said, tonight I'm planning international expansions, hosting galas for New York society, and she hesitated, then decided to be direct, and wondering why the man I love hasn't asked me to marry him yet. Alexander went very still against her. Emma, it's okay, she said quickly, stepping back to look at him. I'm not pressuring you. I thought maybe after everything we've been through together, after building a life and a business and surviving actual international conspiracies, you might be ready to make it official. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, then began to laugh. Emma, do you remember what you said to me the night we first kissed? Emma frowned, confused by the change of subject. Which part? You said that getting involved with me was a terrible idea that could cost us both everything, Alexander reminded her, his smile growing wider. And it was, Emma replied, still not understanding where he was going with this. And I said it was absolutely catastrophic, Alexander continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. But here's the thing about catastrophic risks, Dr. von Habsburg. Sometimes they lead to the most extraordinary rewards. Emma's breath caught as Alexander dropped to one knee, producing a ring box that looked suspiciously like it had been in his pocket all evening. Emma von Habsburg, he said, his voice suddenly rough with emotion. 2 years ago, you saved me from corporate espionage with a simple note. But what you really saved me from was a life without purpose, without real love, without someone worth fighting the whole world for. Emma's eyes filled with tears as he opened the box to reveal a ring that was absolutely perfect. A brilliant cut diamond surrounded by emeralds set in platinum that caught the restaurant's soft lighting. You've already made me the happiest man alive. Alexander continued, you've shown me what it means to use wealth and power for something meaningful. Taught me that the best partnerships are built on mutual respect and shared values. Now I'm asking you to make it permanent. Will you marry me? Emma stared down at him. This impossible man who'd risked everything to give her justice, who'd stood with her through danger and betrayal, who'd helped her build something beautiful from the ashes of her old life. Alexander Sterling, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Are you seriously proposing to me in the same restaurant where I used to serve you dinner? Is that a problem? Alexander asked, suddenly uncertain. Emma laughed through her tears. It's perfect. Absolutely perfect. Of course I'll marry you, you ridiculous man. Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, then stood to kiss her properly. Emma melted into his arms, marveling at how perfectly they fit together, how right this felt after everything they'd survived. I love you, she whispered against his lips. I love you too, Alexander replied more than I ever thought possible. As they stood in the empty restaurant where their love story had begun, Emma reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd lost everything: fortune, family, identity. But in losing it all, she'd found something infinitely more valuable: a partner who saw her worth, a purpose that gave her life meaning, and a love that had conquered every obstacle. So, Alexander said, breaking their comfortable silence, where should we have the wedding? Vienna? New York? Somewhere completely neutral. Emma considered the question seriously. 2 years ago, the thought of returning to Vienna would have terrified her. Now, with Victor gone and her reputation restored, it felt like the perfect way to reclaim her heritage. Vienna, she said firmly, in the family chapel at Schloss Habsburg. It's time to come home. Alexander's smile was brilliant. Vienna it is. Though I should warn you, I'm planning to invite everyone. Business associates, foundation board members, half of New York society. This is going to be the wedding of the century. Emma laughed, picturing the chaos that would result from Alexander Sterling's idea of a small wedding. As long as you're there, I don't care if you invite the entire United Nations. Don't tempt me, Alexander replied with a grin. I know some people in the UN who would love an excuse to party in an Austrian castle. 6 months later, Emma von Habsburg-Sterling stood in the chapel of her family's ancestral home, wearing a gown that had belonged to her great-grandmother and holding a bouquet of Austrian white roses. The chapel was packed with guests from around the world: business leaders, diplomacy officials, foundation beneficiaries, and the few family members who'd remained loyal to her memory during the dark years. Helena stood as her maid of honor, radiant in a rose-colored gown, and completely transformed from the broken woman who'd appeared in Emma's office a year earlier. Working for the foundation had given her purpose, and her success in establishing their European operations had restored her confidence. You look beautiful, Helena whispered as they prepared to walk down the aisle, and happy, so completely happy. I am, Emma replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. For the first time in years, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The music began, and Emma walked down the aisle of the chapel where generations of her family had been married, toward the man who'd proven that fairy tales could come true even in the modern world. Alexander waited at the altar wearing a morning coat that emphasized his broad shoulders and confident bearing, but his eyes were soft with love and wonder as he watched her approach. The ceremony was conducted in both German and English, honoring both their cultures and their shared future. When they exchanged vows they'd written themselves, there wasn't a dry eye in the chapel. Emma, Alexander said, his voice strong and clear, 2 years ago, you warned me about danger with a simple note. Today I promise to spend the rest of my life protecting you from any threat, supporting your dreams, and proving every day that you were worth every risk I ever took. I love you beyond measure, and I'm honored to call you my wife. Alexander, Emma replied, her voice shaking with emotion. You saw past my disguise to the woman I really was, even when I'd forgotten her myself. You gave me back my name, my purpose, and most importantly, my faith and love. I promise to stand with you through every challenge, to build something beautiful with you, and to love you with the same fierce determination you showed when you decided to save me. You are my hero, my partner, and my heart. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander's kiss was tender and full of promise. As they turned to face their guests as Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, the chapel erupted in celebration. The reception was held in the castle's grand ballroom, restored to its former glory, with funds from Emma's recovered inheritance. As Emma and Alexander shared their first dance as husband and wife, she marveled at the perfection of the moment. Everything she'd lost had been returned to her, but more than that, she'd gained something she'd never had before: a partnership built on equality, respect, and unshakable love. No regrets? Alexander asked as he spun her around the dance floor. He looked around the ballroom at their gathered friends and family, at Helena dancing with one of Alexander's business partners, at the life they'd built together from the ruins of her old existence. None, she said firmly. Every terrible thing that happened led me to you. Every loss made me appreciate what we have. I wouldn't change a single moment. Alexander's smile was brilliant. Good, because I have plans for us, Mrs. Sterling. Big plans, such as? Emma asked, intrigued. Well, the foundation is expanding to Asia next year, Alexander said, and I've been thinking about running for the UN Human Rights Council. Plus, there's the matter of those children we've talked about. Emma laughed, feeling overwhelmed by the richness of possibilities stretching before them. One thing at a time, Mr. Sterling. We have the rest of our lives to change the world. Yes, Alexander agreed, pulling her closer. We do, and I can't wait to see what we accomplish together. As the evening continued and their guests celebrated around them, Emma and Alexander Sterling stood together in the ballroom, where she'd once danced as a child, now ready to build a legacy that would span continents and decades. They'd found each other in the shadows of corporate espionage and international crime, but their love had grown strong enough to light the way for countless others, seeking their own justice and redemption. The hidden heirs had reclaimed her throne, but more importantly, she'd found her king, and together they would write a love story for the ages.